Hello, and welcome to Lore Watch, a roundtable freeform discussion about lore and our favorite media. I'm your host, Joe Perez, one of several lore-focused folks from Blizzard Watch, and I've got my marvelous co-host with me today, Matt Rossi. How you doing today, Matt?
Jan Rog. Yeah, that's all.
Rog.
That's the only Captain Marvel reference I could come up with today.
Fair enough. Well, today we are going to be answering...
Hey, you've got a tuxedo on in this?
What's that?
Your email is a little picture of you. You're wearing like a suit.
Yeah.
I just noticed that. I'm sorry, people.
For those of you at home,
the lore of Joe Perez. So what's with this suit?
For those of you at home, I updated my personal profile on my Google stuff so that it is a little more professional image, because occasionally I join meetings from home, and it is variable whether it decides to use my work profile or my home profile. So I wanted them to look a little bit closer just in case, because me getting eaten by a mimic is not exactly the thing I want vendors to see. But that's not what we're here to talk about.
Yeah, he doesn't want vendors to think that mimics get him a lot. You know, no. We're not going to be vendors for a guy who can't even fight off a mimic. I mean, come on.
But we're going to be answering your questions from our wonderful listeners at home. If you have questions for this or any of our podcasts, be sure to send those in to podcast@blizzardwatch.com. Specify the show that it is for in the subject line, and as well as send along any special pronunciations of your name when you send those in. If you want to send those into Discord, we have the Q and Podcast Questions channel. And if you are a Patreon subscriber, we have the Patreon Q and Podcast Questions channel, where we tend to look for first as a special way of saying thank you to our wonderful Patreon sponsors for helping us keep the lights on. Our first one comes from Tetsemi. You may have heard that name once or 3,000 times before. We love you, Tetsemi.
Tetsemi, there's a name I haven't heard. Well, no, actually, I heard it this week. Never mind.
Joe said during an answering of a question on the Blizzard Watch podcast that WoW isn't a narrative game. The question was about whether housing or dateable NPCs would come first in WoW, so that housing is much more likely. I'd like to hear some more discussion around that point, as it resonated with me. There's a ton of story and lore in and around WoW, but it always seemed to be an MMO first and an RPG second. Thoughts? So that's kind of where I was going with it, and I'll open this up by, word vomiting all over the place so Matt can take a drink of water. WoW does have a lot of story, and there's a lot of story tied up into it, but it is not a narrative first game. If it was, I'm not saying this as an insult, I'm saying this as a matter of fact, there would be more focus and resources dedicated to it and making it a tighter experience when it came to how integral it was. You would also see things more akin to like Life is Strange or other games that are very narratively focused, where decisions would have more ramifications. Based off the fact that it is a medium of MMO video game that all this stuff is put into, that sort of tailors how narrative it can be. It has an overarching story, but ultimately your decisions have finite paths that they can travel. We've talked about this a lot. So it's not going to be like Octopath Traveler, or it's not going to be like some of the huge JRPGs that have branching stories, or the visual novels that have branching stories, or the dating sims, or things like that have deep decision trees that give you various different endings. We talked about in the previous Lore Watches about Fallout. Fallout is a really good example of a game that is very narrative focused, even though it may not have originally meant to be. Everything you do has decisions and ramifications that echo throughout the gameplay and change the story that you experience as you're moving through it. While there may be a air quote canonical ending, because there are multiple games in the series, you as the player can experience a vastly different narrative. And back in the day, you and your friend may have made completely different choices, and when you're sitting around the school lunchroom table talking about those stories or those choices, you got a completely different story, and so then it felt like a completely different game. It also adds to the replayability of it. WoW, the quests where you have to go kill 10 boars and bring back their tusks will always be the quests that you have to kill 10 boars and bring back 10 tusks. Again, it's not saying that there's not a story or a compelling story. Hell, we wouldn't be here if there wasn't. But it's just not the primary focus. The focus is primarily the gameplay, the reward loops, and the player experience from a gameplay standpoint. That's really sort of like the meat of that idea. And I can shut up now and let Matt talk a little bit about it if he wants.
I mean, I've been thinking about how to explain this. There's a very big difference between telling a narrative and involving you in the telling of the narrative. With a few exceptions, there's extremely little variation in what choices of yours cause to happen in World of Warcraft, for the very simple reason that it is a multiplayer game where they don't have the desire/ability to reconcile other players' choices. So if you could go to the Battle of Undercity and make a choice that caused Undercity to become a smoking crater in the ground versus a choice where, you've now, made Undercity twice as big, you'd have to basically come up with ways to make it so that one player could see the hole in the ground and the other could see that it's twice as big while they still go around playing the game. And the story of the game wouldn't have a big discrepancy if the city was a hole in the ground versus the city being twice as big. Fallout doesn't have to do that, since we used Fallout as the early example here. Fallout can give you a completely different story from that point. It can have what they call inflection points. A story that is a narrative-based storytelling experience, whether or not it's also a full role-playing game or not. There are some games that are literally just narrative games. They don't even have... they have a very minimal or almost no conflict resolution other than just dialogue and choices. Those games are basically built all around inflection points. But even like games like Wrath of the Righteous or Baldur's Gate 3 have inflection points where your decisions change what happens. And since WoW doesn't have an end point in its storytelling, it's very unlikely to do that. I've yet to see a quest in WoW that had more than a minimum choice. The closest I can come up with was stuff that came up during the Battle for Azeroth era.
The N'Zoth stuff, right?
Yeah, with N'Zoth stuff, or the fact that you could choose to be loyal to Sylvanas from a Horde perspective. You could be loyal to Sylvanas and be spying on all these people, or you could be, you straight up a traitor to Sylvanas and be working against her. It still didn't really change what happened. Yeah, but it changed the way you interacted with it. That's the most I've seen in World of Warcraft. I heard you try and talk so.
No, I was going to say the other thing to keep in mind here, too, is that WoW is not unique in this regard, right?
No.
Two other extremely popular MMOs are in the same boat. And obviously, this is going to be Final Fantasy XIV, which has a massive following. It's probably the largest MMO competitor to WoW as far as consistent player base. It's very heavily story focused. It has a very large focus on the story, but it is not a narrative game. It tells a compelling narrative, like Matt pointed out, but the decisions that you make are always going to be rather limited, or they're going to be inflection points that don't really change the vast outcome. Guild Wars 2 is the same way. Having played through all of the recent expansions on Guild Wars 2, and by recent, I mean I haven't played. I played everything from Thorns forward because I hadn't, and completely forgotten everything that existed. But as experiencing that, it told a compelling story, but it wasn't the primary focus, and your decisions really didn't morph anything. There are again those inflection points.
Yeah, sorry. One way to look at it is this: in a narrative-based story, it's about how your decisions can affect the world and how the world can affect you. In a non-narrative focused game, the decisions are all about how the world affects you. Like, the world will not be allowed to be affected by you because somebody else has to come through here and do all this same stuff. And if they change the world by their actions, then they're going to have to basically set up, state A and state B and state C of the world. And then they're going to have to carry all of them forward. It becomes untenable fairly quickly with a massively multiplayer style game. It is not impossible to have some of these moments. One of the best, although not as popular as one might expect, the best MMOs of the past 15 years, I would say one of the best is Star Wars, The Old Republic.
Absolutely.
And Star Wars, The Old Republic has come up with a way to allow you more options on how your actions affect the world by making a lot of it almost independently unique to you. Like, a lot of your companion stories and a lot of the stories themselves are told almost in a completely instanced way, where you don't necessarily interact with it unless it's your story. And I think they can get away with it partially because it's a very BioWare-esque feeling. Like the first time I played the Old Republic, I think I said something effective. Wow, this is the best single player Star Wars game we've had since the original KOTOR.
Heck,
that's how it feels.
Alex, Adam, and I, when we were still doing the Holocron stuff, because we had a brief website for a period of time devoted to it because that game was so good. We all said the same thing, right? Like it had such a really compelling single player story that it was hard not to think of it as a single player game.
And those stories were relatively well segregated from the world at large.
Yeah, and even in the instances where you interacted with other players, because you can do dungeons. There were dungeons that you could go out and do, but when you did them, for lack of a better term, the result of everything, because there were decision trees and dialogue options, they were done by committee, almost like you were experiencing it with a live D&D play group, like you were an adventuring party that was arguing of what the best response was. And then whatever got the most votes, that's how it would play out, and that's how the rest of the instance would carry on from there, which was a very interesting way to, implement that when it had that decision-making built into it at a core level. So again,
it's a unique experience. Another game that had kind of an interesting approach to it, although certainly not to that level, was the City of Heroes / City of Villains games. Mm-hmm. That, because a lot of it was, when you were playing by yourself, it was literally like you were starring in a comic book. And then when you do team ups, it was literally like either you were now in a team comic or you were in a team up comic. Like the old Brave and the Bold comic where Batman would meet up with some new person every so often. Or DC Comics Presents, where it was either Superman meets up with somebody or this person meets up with this person, and then the person who met up with the last person is now the star for the next issue and meets up with a new guy who then becomes the star of the issue after that. And thus you'd have these chains of story happening. They managed a lot of stuff that felt along those lines. I honestly feel like to this day, I feel like City of Heroes doesn't get the
attention.
Really, it doesn't get the attention or the respect it deserves because it came out before WoW.
A year before WoW.
Yeah, it came out like I want to say either late 2003 or early 2004, but I don't remember which. But either way, it was out for quite some time before WoW came out, and it did things differently in a way that a lot of other MMOs glommed on. City of Heroes was doing like mentoring way before anyone else.
Actually, no, it came out the same year as WoW, just a few months earlier.
Yeah, like that's why I was thinking. Right. I thought it was like early in January. January
April. It was April.
It was April, okay. But still, they gave it 6 months before WoW. And then, of course, it was being, it was on PTRs and so forth, too. And they were also the only one to ever manage to do another game that told its own story in the same universe on the same servers.
With the same player base and NPCs.
Yeah, because if you were playing a villain, you then went and did the villain stuff. But you could interact with the people playing heroes and the hero stuff. It was a much different way than other MMOs did their faction divide stuff.
Also, one thing that I want to shout out to City of Heroes as well, and this is maybe not something for here, but we'll talk about maybe on the main show someday if you guys are interested. It did collective player housing, and it tied it in with the story before other games were doing it, because you created a super base, and the super base was populated with trophies from your conquest as a superhero, just like the Batcave, or just like the
Hall of Justice,
or the Halls of Solitude, or
Avengers Mansion.
Yeah, like it integrated that, but you only got those items when you completed storylines and quests and defeated powerful foes, and it was really kind of cool because it's the only game that I've seen that really tied in the world to something like the player housing. And it was well before its time. It's well before Final Fantasy XIV did player housing. Before WildStar did their player housing as well.
I think the player housing for City Heroes came around 2005.
I want to say it was not too long after that. Yeah,
but regardless, the real thing to take away from this too is that these were all decisions in the case of City of Heroes that were also narratively rooted. Like when Joe is talking about the trophies and stuff you got for doing those things, there were like little things that were narratively rooted. Like the city itself had like things that happened to it before WoW ever even decided they were going to do progressive storytelling where stuff came out and change the world.
Yeah, like
City of
before
Heroes was doing
Cataclysm,
it.
City Heroes did that.
Yeah, City of Heroes was having alien invasions, and when they did put City of Villains out, there was a whole event that then broke off City of Heroes into the Rogues Islands, which was always hilarious to me because that's Rhode Island, Rogues Island, haha. But yeah, so I think that the reason that WoW has always been extremely conservative in its storytelling, and that's not a criticism of it, it's just that they've always been very mindful of the fact that they don't want to make anything drastically impede their ability to get as many people of many playstyles as possible can play this. And like you can play as Horde or Alliance, and you can still basically see the same story, which leads to them basically restricting choice as much as they can. And it's not really a surprise, but it is what it is, I think, is what I would say. There is certainly a narrative, there's certainly a story, but narrative in role-playing games has a ludonarrative progression. It has the story as gameplay. And when you have that, you either go whole hog with it and you end up with like 36 different endings, or in a game like WoW, you don't have an ending. You can't have, Jaina can't simultaneously die and become the Lord Admiral of Kultiris. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's just too many balls to keep in the air for storytelling purposes.
Yeah, but that's also why it's easier to have add elements to a game like that are more gameplay focused, right? They're more about the mechanics. They're more about players interacting with mechanics than it is players interacting with the story. And just to kind of like not beat this to death or anything like that, but when you are working through a lot of things in WoW, there's a reason why it refers to you not generally by your character name, but by titles. And we've talked about this before, because like in Shadowlands, you are not the only Maw Walker. You are a Maw Walker. Or when you're in Battle for Azeroth, you are not the champion. You are a champion of your faction. And that allows them to operate the story as if multiple people are completing that particular type of story and not focusing on a single player, which is a departure from how it used to be a few years prior. I think really want to say Cataclysm, and I want to say even I think Mists of Pandaria really sort of revolved around like almost like a weird single player narrative, but still in the world, even though you weren't doing it alone. And I think we've commented on this before. But there are these elements where you have to, the story is informed by the fact that it is an MMO, that there has to be accommodations made for the fact that there are multiple players experiencing the same thing. So just food for thought. And again, it's not that it doesn't have a story. It's not that there isn't a compelling story. It's just that it's a completely different setup, and it has to make accommodations based off of that. Hopefully that answers your question, Tetsemi. I will just make sure that Matt doesn't have any final thoughts before we move on to the next one.
I mean, I have more thoughts, but I also think we can move on to the next one, because otherwise this would just be us talking about narrative structure and how storytelling works in a long form.
I mean, we could
function. I just don't think that there's nothing more profitable to be mined from this right now. I think we should move on because we do have other questions. All
right. Our next question comes from our friend Roxy, our favorite goblin enthusiast, with a question about the pre-war within short story, The Goblin Way. As someone who mained a goblin for over a decade, I've always been saddened by how goblins always get the short end of the stick when it comes to lore. Goblins have often been comedic relief, or as easy cannon fodder, helping people like Garrosh's Iron Horde, or support Sylvanas with Azerite weaponry. But in 8.2, it felt like Gazlo was being presented as something else when he led the Horde onto Mechagon, particularly with how he was contrasted with Tinkermaster Overspark's self-absorbedness of his individual quest for fame and glory. They made Gazlo leader of the Bilgewater Goblins at the end of BFA. With The Goblin Way, where do you think Blizzard is heading with Goblin lore, and do you think that the changes to the Goblins are good? The War Within seems to have a heavy focus on more Alliance-allied races, but the largest presence from the Horde is the Goblins. I'm looking forward to where we go. Remember always, Goblin products are built to blast. Matt, did you get to read the story?
I didn't finish it, but I do have it. I think I'm up to the part where Noggenfogger is being a jerk, but I mean it's page 1, so it's Gazlo and Noggenfogger dealing with stuff. I've gotten that far.
So what do you think?
I
We can talk about broader strokes of goblins.
No. I'm trying to find a way to say this that doesn't sound dismissive or mean. Everybody likes something, and some things can be really important to some people and not particularly important to others. Like, I don't expect anyone else to care about Ashkandi as much as I do. Like, I could literally talk about Ashkandi for 300 days. I have never thought the goblins implementation in World of Warcraft was worth its time. They were fine when they were like not a playable race, but I felt like when they became a playable race, their intro was the most lackluster thing I'd ever seen. And not that they couldn't have had a good story, not that there weren't good story elements in it, but when you get to the part where basically Gallywix, it was Gallywix, right? He was the first trade prince in the Horde.
Gallywix.
When Gallywix basically is this sneering presence who betrays everybody and essentially sells you into slavery when he's getting people off the island. And then, of course, after you do all this stuff, he gets put back in charge. I was like, Thrall, what are you doing? This is the worst decision you could possibly have made. And of course, it comes back to bite everybody in the butt. And he ends up working with Sylvanas and so forth. But from that moment, I thought, okay, the Gilneas story is about heroics and sacrifice and, darkness and this curse. And then it gets broken off and doesn't. The people who played those Worgens don't get to play the end of it. That goes to the Horde. And it feels like, we did that. The Horde got the end of this really interesting story. Well, in order to balance it, we're going to make the Goblin opening part really bad. And so it goes from the story of you as this young hotshot factory runner, factory foreman type guy who's like, totally a big part of Goblin society, and he's like going to be a big deal. And then, of course, Deathwing and all the bad stuff happens, and you lose everything, and you have to like try to save your people from like this short-sighted jerk who was once kind of your mentor, and then it doesn't go anywhere, and he just sits there for like 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, I don't even remember how many years, doing nothing until suddenly he decides, okay, I'm going to help Sylvanas do cartoonishly evil things just because. So yeah, I've never felt like and this is not that if you play a goblin, you shouldn't like goblins. I feel like if you play a goblin, you should be upset that they kept not having much of a story. I hope this means they're going to get more of a story. I do like having Gazlo as the main goblin, for lack of a better word, as the kind of goblin focus guy. I like that the Bilgewater cartel is now kind of integrated into the Horde to a degree. I think these are interesting things to do, but I still don't know where it's going. Like, quite frankly, I don't know. So I don't know how to explain this. And I know you're trying to jump forward. So all I can say is I want to see what they're going to do with the goblins in the War Within, if anything, because it feels like they're trying to.
It feels like they're course correcting goblins a bit. And I think part of that is because for the longest time, goblins have been a caricature. More so than gnomes, right? Like our wonderful little pseudo halflings, they have been always sort of like they're the good side of the coin, and to Roxy's point, goblins are sort of like this caricature of what they are. They're plagued by sort of characteristics of being cheapskates, cutting corners, being greedy. Trying to, get the most out of whatever while giving the least that they possibly can. And it feels like with this short story, which, I mean, it's a good short story. It's 32 pages long. I highly recommend people give it a read. One of the things that I think really stands out is Gazlo himself as a character feels like a vehicle with which they're trying to correct how goblins are.
And they're doing it, I will say this for this. They're doing it in a way where he doesn't just act like completely differently.
No, he acts like a goblin.
Yeah, he's still a goblin. He's still all that stuff that he's done in the game over the years. He's still the guy who did all of that. So that's a good thing. They're not suddenly like the Council of Altruistic Goblins didn't just show up. They're still goblins. So I think that's worth pointing out. No,
but I mean, things that I should also mention too, like you are correct. There's some highlights to him looking around Noggenfogger's mining operations, and them looking at like the shoddy workmanship, the dilapidated railings, the rushed patch jobs, machines not running effectively because they haven't shut them down to repair them. They just run them till they explode, essentially. And also doing that to the goblins, because the goblins have their hierarchy is pretty violent. If you're a trade prince or an overseer, if you have a good amount of wealth, you're in charge, and it is essentially a characterization of capitalism at its absolute worst. That's what it is. And then the goblins that don't have it are treated as slaves. When you play the goblin experience, when you go through it and you lose your wealth, that's exactly what happens to you. You're treated as if you are, just fodder for the machine. But even here, he points out, he's like, you're not even stopping to take care of your equipment or your workers. How do you expect to be efficient? And that's where he's approaching it from. He's approaching it from the angle of still the mindset of a goblin, maximizing their profit, but also like combating, like, we should have better craftsmanship. We should shut down for maintenance, because you're going at a breakneck pace. You're actually making it worse. And trying to sort of like change that mindset a little bit.
Well, there's actually an interesting point too in the story, since I hadn't remembered it. There's a bit where Gazlo is telling a story about how after Gallywix had messed everything up, Thrall came to him, and Thrall, it's like, we want you to do this, and he offered to take less money from Thrall than he could have gotten. And I think it's Nagenfogger he's talking to, is like, you can't tell me you didn't make a ton of money on it. He goes, I made a profit. But we both knew I could have charged more. Because the thing is that they couldn't understand that a goblin could do that. That a goblin could actually deliberately take less than they could get. And the thing is that got me his respect, and his respect is worth more in the long run than the money would have been then. So it's still profit. It's just understanding when you can profit differently.
Yeah, like
that's a good point. Yeah,
there's a quote in here from Gazlo too, where it's like they're talking about the idea of like, it's not personal, it's business. This is where Nagenfogger basically says, that's the market though, right? Business is business. And Gazlo replies back with, business is personal. When you wreck someone's home, that's personal, and it's bad for business. And it's this idea of trying to like change that mindset. And it's like, you are going to hurt the business more than you're going to help it by being as cutthroat and as detached from the effects of what you're doing are. Sound familiar? And then it's one of those things where like Gazlo wants to give them the idea of creating a sustainable environment. And Nagenfogger's response is, what are you now, a shaman? And the reply is, I've been called worse by better people, but I'm glad you mentioned it. Part of why I'm here is that the elements themselves have taken offense to stuff like what's happening here. And what the venture company does, I'm hearing, Azeroth is about out of patience with us and you, Mayor of Gadgetzan, leader of the Steam Weedle Cartel, and head of this operation. You got to take your share of responsibility for that. He's basically appropriately saying, you got a target on your back because of the decisions you're making, and it's going to be bad. The other thing that I think is really interesting, too, about this story is it points out something that I think people often forget. Not all goblins are part of the Horde. Only one faction is. And
I think maybe now two.
Maybe
you kind of have to count the Bilgewater as at least somewhat in there now.
Yeah. But there are multiple factions of goblins, and the vast majority of them are actually independent of, whether they're Alliance or Horde. They don't care. They're doing their own thing. So I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind. And I think you're right. I think we have an opportunity here as we move forward to sort of, I'm trying to think how to phrase this properly, course correct. I think make them less a caricature. You can still have like some of the elements of it. You can still have the fact that they understand things as a transactional relation, but not have it be amped to 11. It doesn't have to be. They can still feel like goblins without having to do that. We talked about the Goblin Shaman in a way, right? Where Goblin Shaman are sort of unique. They don't operate like other shaman, but they also don't operate like other goblins. They make deals. They understand how that stuff works. That's the goblin nature. But they do it in harmony with the spirits. They have that sort of balance where it's like, listen, you get this, I get this, everybody's happy. We can do that. And that's why they make good shaman. They're effective at negotiating. They can do that. And I think that's woefully underrated or woefully under highlighted as far as goblins go, right? Like they're not just they're not just this full caricature. And I say that a lot, but it's really the only thing that comes to mind over and over again.
Yeah, it is. They are always in danger of being considered a stereotype. And part of the reason is that sometimes they are acting like that. Like I remember going to Stone Talon. Wow, very different place. But there's the original quests back in what is now called WoW Classic. At the time was just WoW. When you go to Stone Talon as a horde player, and you run into the I think it was the Steam Needles. Might have been Steam Needles, and they're basically just clear cutting a forest for no reason. like other than just to clear cut the forest. I mean, obviously it's for money, but it's like there's no real hook into why this is happening. What do the goblins get out of it in particular? They're just there, and you have to stop them. And that's the problem. Is if you just use goblins to, okay, their goblins are bad because they're capitalists, and it's like, okay, couldn't they have a motivation other than that? Like just maybe some sort of idea of why these people are doing the things they're doing. I feel like we could have that. Like there's no, and so it's cool to see something like this story where you at least have Gazlo saying, look, like for the love of all that's worthwhile, could we at least understand that if you cut the goose open, you can't get the next golden egg out of it. Like you have to let it, like I'm coming back to the goose with the golden eggs a lot lately this month because I keep thinking about this, but it's very much that story doesn't exist because there were actual geese, putting out golden eggs. That story exists because it's a warning that if you have something of value, you can push it too far and then it's destroyed and it's not worth anything anymore. And I think that's actually really what Gazlo's message in this entire story is.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. And I think it's also very telling that we got a story about goblins in the lead up to the expansion. So I'm A-okay with that. I think that's actually really good. But I think that answers that question. We're going to move on to the next one here. Felinae asks, how old is Khadgar? My guild was discussing this during raid the other night, and does his vitality match his bodily age? I think on paper he's like 54 or something like that. He's in his 50s.
He was like a young man during the First War, which is, I believe, on paper about 40 years now. So yeah, he'd be in his 50s, his mid 50s. Maybe he could be up to 60 now. I don't know.
I think he was like end of 40s, early 50s when Legion hit.
Yeah, maybe. The problem with Khadgar, of course, is while we're talking about this, we are kind of avoiding the elephant in the room, which was that Khadgar went from a teenager to appearing to be in his 70s during the events of the First War. Like, he got aged way up. So for a long period of time, like when if you ever play like Warcraft 2 and you see the scene where they go forth and they blow up the Dark Portal and there's Khadgar with like a super long old beard and like massive mustache and he's bald and he's actually hunched over and using a staff to walk. He was maybe 17.
Bear in mind, this is the image or the Khadgar that we first interact with when we go to Outland. When we see him inside the city, that's what we like, how we see him. That long white beard, that bald head. So
yeah. So then afterwards, apparently, at some point, I don't know if he just shaved or if it's an outright full transformation, but he got himself looking a lot younger. Like the Khadgar we see hanging around nowadays is like what my wife calls a silver fox. I mean, he's just straight up, he got himself an upgrade. Yeah, but there was a long period of time where he was just this old bearded dude, and that kind of makes it hard to gauge how vital he is now. Like, I couldn't tell you because I don't know if he de-aged himself back to his proper age, which would still have him being in his 50s at this point because he's been around forever, or if he just is ageless because he's a wizard and he can just kind of like magic his way around. Like when I am trying to like do something heavily strenuous, I get aches and pains. I don't know if he just magics everything and so he doesn't have that problem. I couldn't tell you.
There might be another option though too, right? He lives in Karazhan.
That's fair. Yes, he does.
And Karazhan does what?
It does. It is. It's literally backwards in time. So it's possible that he spent 30 years living in Karazhan, and thus he de-aged 30 years because he was in there the whole time. That's entirely possible. And it would have meant that he doesn't have to isolate himself too much from Karazhan's effects for fear of turning into a baby.
Yeah, he's got time to spare almost.
He starts super old. He can go in there and get himself de-aged for a while, and he just should be fine with it. That is entirely possible. So good catch. I hadn't thought of that one.
Yeah, and then there's also the we don't know the full breadth of Atiesh as well, and what Atiesh's power really can do, or what it does, or if it's infusing him with any sort of vitality or life. Vitality is a weird question to sort of or a weird aspect to kind of suss out. Because you can have the Master Roshi syndrome, right? Where you have this really old guy who, given the opportunity can, pump up his chi and go absolute beast mode. And that's a huge source of vitality. Or you can have a young guy that just doesn't have any, or woman or person. Khadgar, for better or worse, is, I think, been sort of moved into a period where he's at his, I'm going to air quote, actual age. He seems to be in terms of when you look at him, he looks like a man who is about the age that he actually is. He is in his 50s, and he looks like he's in his 50s. He looks like he's in a good 50s. He doesn't look bad, but he definitely looks like a guy in his 50s. Yeah. So all these things may be factors, and it will also be interesting if we ever find out the truth about it, because I'm really curious what the answer is, because I don't know that we ever got an actual answer. Like Matt said, I went through and looked, and I didn't see anything that says this is why he looks younger. I mean, it's just kind of like jazz hands magic, I guess. But it would be nice to see if there was a tie-in, here's why he showed up and looks as young as he does. Yeah, we'll see. We should
also point out that there was a period of time where he was not in Karazhan or on Azeroth at all. He spent at least 20 years on Outland.
It's true.
So, and it's interesting too, if you look at the end, there's pictures of him at the end of Warcraft 2, Tides of Darkness. I said he looks older, and he does, but he doesn't have that white beard that you see when you go to Outland and run into him. He's got gray hair, but he's mostly got a brown beard. It's more like the Reed Richards effect, where he's got
the streak in it. Yeah.
Yeah. And as he, so he obviously aged some on Outland, but then when you see him again, he doesn't really, he seems to have de-aged again since, and we really can't tell how or why. So,
all right. Well, hopefully that answers your question. We're going to move on to our next one here, which comes from Satire, a Void Elf survival hunter from Arathor. So the Boy King returns. What do you speculate is his role in the upcoming expansion? Do you speculate his girlfriend Sylvanas will also make an appearance? I'm just going to go out on a limb and say Sylvanas is not making an appearance. We are sort of done with her for a while.
I think the most you might get is you might get a quest where she gets mentioned or something like that. I think she got a brief mention somewhere recently that was basically just she sent a letter. That's the most I think you can expect. In the Belamath
ending, where you start going, you go through, you do hear that she sent missives essentially saying, congratulations. I'm paraphrasing. It's a lot more than that, but she's not present, right? And she's still toiling. She's still doing the work. She's doing what she was told to do. And let's be realistic.
There's an implication she's also looking for Nathanos.
I was just going to say that. Let's be honest. She's also looking for Nathanos, because when she realized towards the end, which caused her to turn and help us and blah, 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 that Nathanos died, but he didn't show up there. So where is he? That was sort of the light bulb moment for her. And she still hasn't found him yet. And
their adorably tsundere relationship continues.
And then we also had a moment where Anduin talked with her. There's a quest line where he went and talked with her. And we saw that interaction. And that's really about it. So I don't think she's going to make an appearance unless, and this is a big unless Anduin decides he needs to talk to her again. Then maybe we'll see a conversation again or something like that, but she won't be a major player, if anything at all.
Yeah, the only reason she might make any kind of appearance is that her sister is a major character in this one.
Yes, and it might be a thing. One of the things I think people are speculating, I think this is why this has come up, and I've seen this on Reddit, and I've seen this in a bunch of other places, where people are speculating that her sister is going to fall into grave peril, and Sylvanas is going to help lead the effort to save her from Xal'atath. That she's going to be instrumental in sort of like a notched arrow will fly loose and like deflect the blade or something like that. We don't know, and we don't know that will happen. It could. That's always a possibility, but I don't think that you're going to see her beyond, like, again, those like touchstone moments, those sort of like inflection points, as Matt referred to them earlier. And maybe she'll show up at the end of the expansion or something involving her sister.
Honestly, though, my thing is that I think it's much, much more likely we'll see Varisa before we see Sylvanas. Because for one thing, Varisa is still around and we haven't had any major storyline with her since Legion, really. And even in Legion, she was more just there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's more likely. Yeah.
Her kids are full grown at this point. I think she's still part of the Silver Covenant.
Technically the Silver Covenant, it still works for her. Like, she's the Ranger General of the Silver Covenant.
And she's still a member of the Unseen Path and all that stuff too. But I would agree with you. I think it's way more likely we see her before we see Sylvanas. And it's also way more likely that she's the one that saves her sister than Sylvanas coming out of the hole. Mostly because, like you pointed out, we haven't really seen a lot with her. She hasn't really done a lot in recent years.
It's like, if you're trying to reach somebody to help with a problem, trying to reach somebody who's not only in the Shadowlands, but in the most isolated of the Shadowlands, it's a bit of an ask. It's theoretically possible, but it's a bit of an ask.
Yeah. So I think that's more likely, and honestly, I'd be A-okay with that. Also because she does have, she herself has a relationship with Anduin. If you go back to Windrunner Three Sisters, there's an exchange between them.
If you read War Crimes, Varisa is often hanging out with Anduin. They spend a lot of time together.
Yeah, because
I'm not saying that by the way, that's not me making a boyfriend-girlfriend comment, because people go there too fast. Varisa is much older than Anduin. But no, he's like helps with her kids. He's very I'm trying to say, conscientious. Yeah, he's very conscientious of her situation. That her husband died, that her sister is, an undead monster. He's very sympathetic.
Her other sister has accepted the callings of the void.
Yeah. I don't think that had happened yet, because this was Miss Pandaria.
Oh, well, fair.
Yeah. As far as we knew, her other sister was dead. Nobody knew where she was at the time. So what I'm saying is, I think that Anduin and Varisa do have a connection. And it would actually be nice to see it, that them deal with that and have them, one of the things Anduin has not had the ability to do, and I'm cutting kind of into your question about what do I speculate is his role. If Anduin at this point takes up rulership again, which we don't know if he's going to, he comes back to deal with this crisis. It doesn't mean he's going to say, I'm the king of the alliance or whatever. But if he does not have his own people. He has people that he inherited. He has people who were either working for his father or
like Brawl Baremantle and why can't I think of her name? The other assassin, the Blood Elf.
Sanguinar. Valeria Sanguinar.
Valeria Sanguinar.
He's got either those people, or he's got like Greymane, who is certainly not necessarily Varian's, but is not really his either. Although they have an interesting relationship. Well, I just think Gen's relationship with Anduin is pretty interesting.
It's almost grandfatherly, I think.
Yes, it almost is grandfatherly. It doesn't feel like he thinks of Anduin as a son, but it does feel like he thinks of Anduin as somebody that he wants to help.
Yes.
And to a certain degree, a little of it is him trying to do what he couldn't do for his own son, but it definitely does feel like there's a regard there. And I did like their interactions. So I think that there is room for something. Now that Greymane doesn't have Sylvanas to worry about or deal with anymore, and we even saw in Battle for Azeroth, he'd let a lot of it go. Mm-hmm. Not all of it, but he'd let a lot of it go. Like he even counsels Jaina's mother, look, you can't hold this. It'll destroy you. So I feel like we could have Gen come back and be a character, but I'd like to see Anduin actually start to get his own people that are part of his, whatever he makes. If he becomes king again, like I would like to see him with his own friends, his own counselors, a new generation of people working with him and around him. I mean, I'd also like to see the Horde Council thing actually get some flesh on it, but we're talking about Anduin right now. I would like to see if Anduin get his own stuff, because that's a lot of his story so far has been about, your dad died, now you have to be king. And that's when we first see him. It's, everyone thinks his dad's dead and he has to be king when he's a little boy. He's had that throne thrust at him so many times in his life. Maybe he doesn't want it. Maybe he doesn't want to be king. But let's see it be Anduin's choice and Anduin's life, not here's the legacy you have to deal with. That's my hope, is we get a story where Anduin's actions are central to himself.
Yeah, and I think that's really what I'm looking for as well, is Anduin to get a spotlight where he's not a victim, first of all, because almost literally everything we've experienced with him, he is a form of victim, whether it's him being trapped in Ironforge and dealing with the uprising, then being broken up by his dad, or him in Pandaria being lost, and then, kind of figuring out where he goes from. The entirety of Shadowlands, like, he hasn't really had time to figure out who the heck he is, even. And we talked about this before, when we talked with Madeline about it. You get to see in the book where he's trying to sort of figure that out, right? Like, you get the scene of him, hiding who he is and, like, pretending to be somebody else just so he can have a normal day. But he's doing that because he's never had an opportunity in all these years to just do something, to just make his own mistakes. And as Matt pointed out, he even had to be king really, really early, and very often, without his father being around. He had to grow up. His chief advisor was a black dragon. His best friend was an old man that grew up to become the replacement Lich King, older man, I should say. Because Bolvar trained him, but like his other mentor was a dwarf, like an older dwarf that had been around for generations. These are not. It's not a childhood that he got.
They're not your pals. They're not your people that you ride or die with.
But you also don't have the opportunity with those people to figure out who you are, because every single one of them is inherited, like you said.
And that's my thing. When you have friends of your own, you make stupid mistakes with them. You do dumb things, and you learn together who you are. And Anduin does not have that. He has never had that. His father's father absolutely had that. Lane Rin had his two ride or die amigos. Let's not think too hard about what happened to them. But, Medivh and Anduin Lothar were Lane's bros. They were his ride or dies. Varian had a very traumatic childhood where he basically lost everybody and had to run away or die. And the guy who took him from his hometown, again, Anduin Lothar, couldn't really be there for him because he was basically fighting alongside the Alliance armies, and he went to his death fighting for the Alliance. So he ended up basically, his only real friends were like Jaina and Arthas and Kalia, but at least they were his friends. Like, he knew them. He interacted with them. He got to make mistakes, and he got to live to a degree. And then, when he got married and he was running around hunting for his father's killer, that's all stuff he got to do for himself. Anduin never got that. He tried to get it on Pandaria, and he ended up, Garrosh almost killed him. He got a bell dropped on him. So in a way, Anduin has always been somebody who's had to deal with other people's expectations of him when he doesn't even know who he is. And I think it's time he gets to show us who he is. I think that's what this story should be. And
I think that might be his role here, because yes, he's going to help Azeroth again, but I think there's an element of self-discovery in that, because Azeroth and him have a lot of parallels. Azeroth is an entity that is still growing up. It's still evolving, still becoming whatever its final form is. And Anduin is very much on that same journey. And through his helping of whatever the current problem is, I think it's potential that he could we can have that self-discovery journey. We can get somewhere closer to, and I pointed this out years ago, and I thought that we were gonna, the comic where we go to Argus, right? It's him, the old man, on the Exodar style ship, because I don't think it was actually the Exodar at this point, with Velen, saying we're going to Argus, like, get in, losers, we're going to Argus. But he was old, but he wasn't grizzled, if that makes sense. It seemed almost wiser. Like, he was definitely tired, and that was the whole point of that comic, was like, he had been ruling, he had been, fulfilling his role, he had been doing his things, but he knew who he was. He had figured out who he was along the way. And we haven't gotten there yet. And I don't think us going to Argus the first time was that moment, because, well, it wasn't. I think, and I brought this up a while ago, we saw a future Anduin going to Argus, for whatever the reason is. We haven't gotten to that future Anduin yet. He's still figuring out who he is. And that's what I think his role is. His role is to figure out who the hell he is. Once you get to that, once we get to that point, I think it's going to be potentially a very interesting story, because, like Matt pointed out, he gets to pick his own people. He gets to find folks to sort of be his confidants. He gets to maybe potentially make some of the mistakes. Like when we go and see him, when Thrall goes and gets him, he's by himself, just kind of overlooking the giant sword stabbed into the side of Azeroth. And I think both of those are very interesting. It's a deep wound in a very like figure. It's something that he can identify with. His wounds are deep. He's been tortured for however long time has passed, right? And I guess how many years passed between Shadowlands start and finish? Because it was a length of time. Do we know?
I think it was like 2 years, because if you go from the beginning of Shadowlands to the beginning of Dragonflight, it's 5-year gap, and it's 3 years between the two. So I think it's 2 years total. On Azeroth, 2 years passed during Shadowlands. In terms of how long Anduin suffered, since Shadowlands doesn't really have a reliable time flow, we have no idea. He could have been in there for hundreds of years. Yeah,
so 2 years in our time, and we don't know how long that was for him. And it could have been, like you pointed out, it could have been 100 years. It could have been a way more lengthy traumatic experience than we're aware of. And so there's that kinship there. He feels that deep wound the same as Azeroth. And I think that's one of the cool and interesting parallels of the story is, yes, he's going to heal Azeroth, but as much it's going to be potentially for him to heal himself. He's going to be able to do something, and I think by doing that, he'll be able to maybe make that connections to his own trauma, to his own problems, and where he's currently at, make those next decisions, but heal a little bit and figure himself out and figure out what he needs to be better. And I think that's really cool. And I hope that's where the story goes for him, because boy, does that guy deserves it. He's been beat up. He's been through a lot. Let's give Anduin a break.
I would also say it's really time for him to get to put everything together, because we've seen in multiple expansions, we've seen Anduin go through different stages of life. We've seen him go from a callow child who always believes the best in people to someone who had that belief essentially shattered. It's time to see who he becomes, like not just what he's been through, but what he makes of it.
Mm-hmm. It's
time to finally get the place we all had to go, because we see a lot of the storytelling in WoW is about, old dudes realizing they're parents now, and which is very much like God of War, where Kratos finally realizes, oh, I got a kid, I got to smarten up. It's time to actually get to see the young man, or it could have been a young woman too, but we're currently using Anduin. There's some data mining that there's more going on, but we'll get back to that. Here's the time to see Anduin finally go from a child to a man. And you know how bittersweet that moment is. When you're like a young adult and you finally realize one day, I'm not just a young adult, I'm just an adult. And I have to, from here on in, I'm going to be an adult until I'm dead. No more for me are the consolations of childhood. I'm not going to get those anymore. And there's a good feeling to it and a bad feeling to it. I'd like to see Anduin get to finally have it. He is not Varian's son anymore. He is Anduin. It's time for him to get to have that. And also, it'd be nice if he got to hit people with a sword. It's a cool sword. He should be hitting people with it. Dang it! Not don't give it to someone else to hit people with it. You hit people with it. Sorry, Varrock, you deserved your go out. You actually convinced me throughout Battle for Azeroth. Varrock Storefang convinced me that I was okay with him dominating the story of the expansion. But it's time for Anduin to hit people himself.
I would agree. But I think that's going to do it for us today, unless there's anything else you want to add, my friend.
That's actually, let me look really fast to make sure I'm not missing anything I want to talk about. Oh yeah, that's way too much.
We have more questions we are going to get to, trust me.
I will say this much. Coming back to like something we talked about earlier about narrative and to tie together everything we're talking about. The narrative of World of Warcraft has really expanded over the time that World of Warcraft has existed.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process has expanded Warcraft in general. So us saying what we said earlier about not being a narrative game, saying something isn't a narrative game is not to imply that it does not have a narrative. And I want to make that point because a lot of people hear, how can it not be a narrative game if it's got a narrative? It's like, well, in much the same way that Avengers has a narrative, but it is not a movie about its narrative.
Mm-hmm.
It's a movie about, sometimes it's about characters, sometimes it's about spectacle. In this case, World of Warcraft is about you in the world of Azeroth. You getting to see it. And it always has been. It's always been a bit like being a tourist. You're sure you've got a character and you can, you'll be in these big fights and you'll see these moments, but the entirety of World of Warcraft is kind of like going to the Caverns of Time when you go back and you do the Battle of Mount Hyjal and you're basically just seeing how it all turned out. When you lose those fights, you just die, wipe, and start over. It doesn't branch off into a narrative where the Legion won. You just try again. So I think that's something to consider.
I would agree. But with that, folks, Blizzard Watch is made possible due to the generous contributions at patreon.com/BlizzardWatch. Your continued support means that this podcast site and community is able to thrive and grow. Blizzard Watch supporters enjoy exclusive benefits like early access to the podcast, better chance at having your question answered on our podcast or the queue, and an ad-free site experience. Again, if you have questions for this or any of our podcasts, be sure to send those into podcast@blizzardwatch.com. Specify the show that it is for in the subject line and any special pronunciation of your name. If you want to hit us up on Discord, we have the Q and Podcast Questions channel where you can submit those. Same rules apply. And if you're our Patreon subscriber, well, why don't you go ahead and hit us up on the Patreon Q and Podcast Questions, where I think all of the questions we've answered today came from. Same rules apply, but it's where we look first as a way of saying thank you to our Patreon supporters. Friends, we appreciate you and the fact that we get to do this every week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.